Welcome to Frameworks. This is a place for coaches who want more than just reps and sets. We dig into principles, philosophy, and stories that help you coach with clarity, design with purpose, and to keep chasing mastery. Today, we're going to dive into part 2 of our 3-part training series, and it's all around smarter program design. So if you missed part 1, the macro, go back and check that out for more context in terms of how to think about long-term planning. But in that episode, we talked about how to think long-term, how to define the story of your client's training, how to plan in seasons, and finally, how to use CoachRx to create a long-term design system. Now it's time to move one layer deeper. Now we're talking about the meso, or what we're gonna call today short-term planning. The meso layer connects the macro to the micro. So it connects the yearly plan to your daily sessions and what you're actually doing in program design. When you understand how to design and link your mesocycles, you can do a few things. Number 1, you can create predictable, measurable progress. Number 2, you can set up every microcycle every day in CoachRx with clarity and purpose. And number 3, you can build systems that evolve seamlessly rather than constantly restarting. So let's get into it. Part 1 was all about the macro. So in part 1, we talked about long-term planning, and we really wanted to zoom out. We wanted to look at, okay, what are we doing with our clients' training over a 12-month period? Now, what we're going to do in part 2 is we're going to hyper-focus on one of those cycles, one of those mesocycles, hence where the word meso comes from, okay? So the meso is where the story begins to get context, okay? So remember we talked about that in part 1 where we said the long-term plan is where you start to create the story for your client. Now we're going to zoom in on the mesocycle and we're going to give that story some context. Okay, so if the macro gives your program direction, the mesocycle gives it movement. Okay, so we're actually now starting to put in the pieces to move your client forward, to move them closer to their goals, no matter what they are. So this is the layer where we're going to build a short-term structure. Let's wrap our heads around, just for purposes of today, around a general 4 to 8 weeks at a time is what we're going to design our cycles in. Personally, I really like and prefer short cycles, so I'm always jumping in and out of cycles every 4 weeks, but to each his own. Okay, so if we can get this layer right, if we can get these mesocycles right, we will stop guessing. Okay, so we'll stop guessing in terms of, what's around the corner in progression. We'll stop guessing in terms of what is proper and improper program design because we've already given this story some context. We're saying over the next 4 weeks, for example, the goal is to build some muscle endurance or build some motor control or build some hypertrophy. Whatever the case is, we're hyper-focused on that thing for the next 4 weeks. Okay, so when we're hyper-focused on that thing, now we start designing with direction. We don't have to guess at our progression, and we can start really seeing the designs that we're giving start to move our clients to where we want to take them. Framework number 1, and this is just absolutely foundational. We have to understand cycle purpose and progression within that cycle. Okay, so every cycle is a focus period of specific stress and a specific aim or what we want to occur in adaptation. It's where we take the broader goals of a season and we actually bring them to life over this 4 weeks. Okay, so something that we have to understand if we can understand cycles are what is a cycle. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk briefly about the 3 foundational cycle types that give structure to all of our training environments. So those cycle types that we're going to talk about in this framework are accumulation, intensification, and deload, and sometimes we're going to call that transitional cycles. Cycle type number 1 is going to be accumulation. Okay, and this is, in my opinion, the most important cycle to really understand because most of our people are going to either live or be in this cycle type very, very frequently. Okay, so in this cycle type, in accumulation, we're developing capacity, we're teaching movement, we're building volume, and we're laying the physiological foundation for intensity later if we are moving our clients into intensification. So something that's really important to understand is not only will most of our clients live here, and most of us should live in this cycle type, but it's actually a prerequisite to take someone into intensity or into an intensification phase. So in resistance, what are we doing here? Okay, so characteristically, what these exercise selections and sets and reps and all of those things look like in an accumulation phase can be summed up with a couple points. Volume is higher and intensity is lower. Okay, so that's going to mean something a little bit different relative to the individual that you're working with. But relatively, this is a high volume cycle and lower intensity cycle. So we want to focus on a couple things here, okay? And now we have some options. We might be focusing on motor control or improving the quality of movement through patterns of movement. We might be focusing on building muscle or hypertrophy, or we might be focused on strength endurance or being able to challenge the motor control and the motor learning in those patterns that we've already learned, and we want to now make those more enduring. So rep schemes might be dipping into a little bit higher thresholds, or we can just be focusing on structural balance or skill building through resistance training. Goals here are to build tissue tolerance so that our tendons, our ligaments, and joints are just a little bit more robust, and to build some coordination through our movement. Okay, so that's generally what we're focusing on in resistance training. We can go a lot deeper. We can do an entire class on accumulation, but those are the main points that I wanted to hit in resistance. Now we go to aerobic training. So aerobic training, characteristically, we want to think longer, slower MAP work. So MAP is the phrase that we use at OPEX, maximum aerobic power, in terms of how we implement and how we progress aerobic training. So we want longer and slower MAP work. So we're always doing MAP 10, zone 1, easy training. But that's not progressive, but we're talking about MAP 9, 8, 7. So 30 minutes of work down to 15 minutes of work is kind of the sweet spot here. And you might be asking yourself, well, why? Why do we want to do longer and slower MAP work that's less intense in accumulation phases? It's because volume is high, right? So when we have volume here in resistance training, we just want to make sure that volume doesn't meet or extend that volume or overarch that volume in aerobics, because it's just going to be very challenging to recover and adapt from that work. So longer, slower MAP progressions here. Okay, something else that's important to understand is when we're going through the longer and slower MAP work characteristically, we need to make sure that we're emphasizing repeatability, we're emphasizing rhythm, and we're emphasizing patience, right? So this MAP work, 9, 8, 7, 30 minutes down to 15, it's relatively low intensity. And the important thing here to make sure that we're actually getting the proper adaptation from the dose that we're giving our people is that people are just patient. Okay, so something that we teach here at OPEX is we teach pacing is about an aerobic training. Okay, this isn't testing. Pacing in aerobic training is about 4 times your work. Okay, that's your pace. So if you're working for 15 minutes and you're doing some aerobic intervals, you want to be going at about your 60-minute or 1 hour pace. And you just have to be really patient to be able to do that. Okay, our next phase of training is intensification. Okay, so now the base is built. We've already gone through numerous cycles of accumulation phases, and now we can start to raise the ceiling. And in terms of ceiling, I just mean intensity. Okay, so when we say the word intensity, we can think about intensity in a couple different ways. Okay, so number one, with resistance training, when we say intensity, we mean that load is higher. Okay, so you're lifting more absolute weight. Okay, so that is a characteristic that will come along with an intensification phase as it has to do with resistance training. In aerobic training, and sometimes even in anaerobic training, if your client is getting that, when we think of intensity, we think of faster, okay, faster turnover, higher efforts, and based on that, a little bit longer rest times relative. Okay, so here we increase intensity and we lower total volume to express strength, power, aerobic and anaerobic tolerance or capacity. So in resistance training, remember in accumulation, we talked about higher volume, lower intensity. Now we're decreasing the volume and we're increasing the intensity. Okay, don't fall into the trap where we try to keep volume really high and then we just try to match intensity with it. You're just setting your people up for failure when you do that. Okay, so there's always an inverse relationship between volume and intensity, between sets and reps. Okay, so as sets go up, volume or intensity goes down. Okay, we want to focus on load, neural drive, and speed of contraction when we're working through intensification. So I think that that's really important to understand, especially if we're starting to prescribe or if we're a coach that prescribes tempos. I think you should always prescribe tempos because people are always moving eccentrically and concentrically through resistance training. So when you quote unquote prescribe tempos, you're just telling them how fast or slow they should be moving through those. So when we are prescribing tempos and intensification, we just want to make sure that the speed of the contraction, especially concentrically or the way up, is always with an explosive intent. Okay, so we don't want to give someone like a 2-second eccentric, 1-second pause, 2 or 3-second concentric. It's like you're not teaching them to be fast, explosive, powerful. And if you're not doing those things, you should probably get out of intensification. Okay, so like I said, you're using less reps and you're using higher intensity sets. So examples would be like you might be doing 3 sets and it might be set 1 is at a 5, set 2 is at a 3, set 3 is at a 1, or maybe it's 6 and 4 and 2, or maybe you're doing 5x5s, right? You can skin the cat a bunch of different ways, but just understand that you're doing higher intensity sets, and to do higher intensity sets, your volume per set has to be lower, okay? So we're not doing 10s in intensification phases and resistance. Now, going over to aerobics, okay, these are shorter and they're faster in terms of map work, okay? So here we're thinking map 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? So that's, as I walk through those, just think 5 minutes all the way down to 30 seconds. Okay, and you might be thinking, what about map 7? That wasn't in accumulation or intensification. Map 7 is very middle zone. That would be about 10 minutes of work. And those are great transitional periods when someone's learning their gears. But I would highly recommend that you don't just have someone perpetually doing map 7, even map 8, because intensities can get a little bit higher, 2 or 3 times a week. So 6 down to 1 is where I would recommend that we kind of quote unquote live in intensification. Okay, so with this, we're going to have more aggressive pacing and we're going to have full recovery between bouts. So just because the pacing is more aggressive does not mean that this now becomes unsustainable work. Okay, so if you're giving someone a 5-minute interval and you're saying, I want you to rest 3 minutes, and you're doing that times 4 to 6 sets, you just want to make sure that the power stays even across the board and it's repeatable and sustainable every single set. If you start to see a dip in repeatability or sustainability, that's a sign that you're probably dipping into more anaerobics, or you're just teaching someone to kind of deal with pain and you're increasing that pain threshold, but you're not actually increasing or improving the aerobic system as you would be if you were focusing more on sustainability and repeatability. Okay, so more aggressive pacing, full recovery between sets, and you can start to add in that anaerobic work here. Okay, so anaerobic work would just be, the 30 seconds on, and instead of 30 seconds off like you do in map 1, it's 30 seconds on and it's like 3 minutes off, 4 minutes off, right? So rest time increases because intensity in anaerobics while you're doing the work is so much higher. Goal there is still to be repeatable, and that's different than sustainable, because when we start talking about sustainability, we're more talking about aerobics. When we talk about repeatability, we're talking about anaerobics, but making sure that if we're doing 5 sets of that 30 seconds on, 4 minutes off, that every 30-second bout is repeatable. Our power stays the same, again, so we're training the system appropriately. All right, and the last phase of training that I'm going to talk about today, and this doesn't encompass all phases of training. If we're working with competitors, we could think about pre-competition phases, competition phases, but relative to the phases of training that most people will go through, this would be the last one. And this is going to be a deload phase or a transition phase. And just right out of the gate, I just want to mention that most people actually don't need deloads because life gives most people deloads. And again, it depends on who you're working with. If you're working with an athletic population that is competing in something and they're unbelievably compliant and you're like really hammering away at them in training, take some deloads, rest and recover. But if you're working with a general population person where you're like, we're just focusing on longevity, vitality, I want you to feel better, maybe they hit 8 out of every 10, 9 out of every 10 training sessions. When they go on vacation, maybe that's a time for them to take that transition period. And that's not really or we would just call that more of a natural deload. So you're not like building out your long-term plan and saying like, well, week 18, we need to do a 1 or 2 week deload. It's like, that's not necessary for most people. Life will give most people a deload. Okay, so these deload phases are important even when they are unintended, is because we have to understand that adaptation only happens when we can recover from the work or from the stressor that we put ourselves through. Okay, so between major accumulation or intensification phases, maybe you do want to plan some deloads or transition blocks to lower fatigue, restore tissue quality, and to prepare for the next phase. Okay, so in CoachRx, you can visually organize these cycles by adaptation, goal, volume, trend, whatever you want to do. And you can kind of get an idea of, if I have, accumulation, intensification, maybe you want to throw a deload phase after that intensification if we're back to back to back and we're hitting 10 out of every 10 sessions over those three sections or 3 cycles. And you just want to make sure that you label them appropriately. Okay, so just make sure that you're labeling them so when you do zoom out and you look at it, you can really understand and discern how many accumulation phases are you doing. CoachRx will automatically label them. If you do 3 accumulations in a row, it'll say accumulation 1 and accumulation 2 and accumulation 3, so you can kind of keep track as you go through the system. Okay, so when we do that, this rhythm of building, expressing, recovering, and repeating is the intent of great programming. But I also want to hit on, where the transition piece comes in this phase. Okay, we have to understand that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we have to understand that just because I'm, ending a phase of training, let's say it's an accumulation phase, and I'm going into an intensification phase, it doesn't mean that the client is like physiologically ready to do that. And I'll be a little bit hyperbolic, but imagine going from 15s down to 3s, right? So on Friday, Saturday, you're hitting 15s and you've done that for, the last 4 weeks or so. And then on Monday, you're like, all right, now we're digging deep and we're hitting 3s. So you can start to use transition phases to kind of like build a bridge from that 15 to that 3. So maybe you take them through, 1 or 2 week transition phase where, you're hitting like 8 to 10s to transition or 6 to 8s to transition to get them really ready in their brains and, everything ready to really start to express through those 3s that you're going to put them through. Framework number 2. All right, now we're actually going to start designing something. So now we are going to dig in and design the specificities around the short-term plan. Okay, so we already set up the short-term plan when we zoomed out and we said, hey, we know that cycle 2, we're going to do accumulation. Now we're actually zooming into cycle 2 accumulation and we're building that out. Okay, so each coach will plan a little bit differently when they walk through this phase, but principles stay the same. You're designing cycles that align with the client's training age, their priorities, their availability, their frequency, so on and so forth. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break this down by resistance training, and then we'll break it down by aerobic training as well. All right, let's talk about designing resistance training, or what we call OPEX gain. So we covered this in the long-term planning video, but you should always have your cycle types and your cycle lengths already determined when we do that long-term plan. But I do want to point out, when we do that long-term plan, it's just an educated guess, right? So you might get 2 or 3 cycles in and you might be kind of, manipulating some dates here, dates there, depending on some decisions that you're making once your client's actually executing inside of that long-term plan. But if you didn't change anything, we already have those preset because we set them up in the long-term phase. So now we're going to get specific with priorities. Okay, so what we want to do here is we just want to prioritize. What are we actually working on within this long-term plan? Let's not have 15 different priorities, maybe like 1 to 3 main things that we really want to focus on in this phase of training. Okay, once we do that, then we're going to plug in our cycle notes. So this is where we're going to do the following. So we're going to identify our split to the client's training age. So we want to make sure that when we identify that split, we're always thinking about, what are we doing on a day-by-day basis in resistance training, and how does that measure up against their training age or even some of their goals. Okay, so some options here would be full body resistance training. Okay, so they're doing full body upper and lower every day. In terms of training age, this is great for the beginner. This is always or also great for the advanced trainee as well. Then we go to upper lower. Okay, upper lower is great for the intermediate. And this is essentially like, you might be doing like push and pull on Monday. You might be doing bend and squat on Wednesday, so on and so forth. So you're just kind of breaking it up. One day is upper, one day is lower. Like I said, this is great for the intermediate. And this one isn't so great if someone's only training like 2 or 3 times a week. Full body resistance, what we just talked about, from a frequency standpoint, in terms of how many times per week are we hitting upper muscles and lower muscles, or upper patterns and lower patterns, full body is best, especially when we're only hitting 2 to 3 sessions per week. Upper lower is great when we're at like 4, 5, 6. Okay, so for those intermediate individuals. Okay, next we could possibly prescribe an isolated pattern day. Okay, so this would be reserved for the advanced, and for the advanced that might be training 5 to 6 times per week. So maybe one day you're only focusing on the push pattern, maybe another day you're only focused on the pull pattern, so on and so forth. So you're just kind of laying those out. The upside is there's hyper focus and they're really nailing that pattern of movement and those muscles specific to that pattern of movement on that given day. The downside is frequency is really low, and because you're beating those muscles up so much, recovery is also going to be difficult for these individuals. Okay, so just make sure that you're thinking about these things when you decide, am I doing full body, am I doing upper lower, or am I doing an isolated pattern split? So these determine your contraction focus. Okay, so what do I mean by contraction focus? We could be focusing on a couple different things when it comes to the types of contractions we're doing. So if we're doing motor control focused, okay, we know that we're focusing more so on learning. Okay, so the goal in this example is to learn how to move through these patterns of movement more effectively. Okay, so now when we start to connect, what kind of a split we're doing and where a motor control focused program would be, we already eliminate upper lower and we eliminate isolated pattern days. And the reason is because if the goal is to learn, frequency is so important. So if frequency is important, we want to do full body splits. So if you're focusing on motor control or motor learning with an individual, let's opt to just stick with full body splits. Then we also have to talk about the cycle type that these connect with. So if we're doing motor control, we're probably doing full body splits. And then the cycle type that this is going to fall into is probably going to be an accumulation phase. It's definitely going to be an accumulation phase, because remember what we talked about in terms of explosive intent, right? So if we are focusing on explosive intent, we're probably focusing on increasing strength, and we're not focused on that in accumulation phases. It will be a byproduct, increased strength for most people in accumulation phases, but that's not the main priority. So motor control, accumulation. The next contraction type would be strength endurance. Okay, so in terms of the split type, we can work on strength endurance through any training split, full body resistance, upper lower, or even isolated pattern. Okay, but when it comes to the cycle of training that we want to focus on strength endurance in, it's going to be accumulation. Okay, you can kind of use it as like accumulation transitioning into intensification, but you're definitely not going to work on improving strength endurance through an intensification phase, because by definition in strength endurance, you're extending your reps, you're extending how much volume you can do. So your main focus, your North Star, is high volume. That goes contrary to an intensification phase. So if we're working on strength endurance, we're going to do that in an accumulation phase, but we can do it through any split. And then finally, max contraction. So this is, I'm just trying to get stronger. Clearly, we are going to do this in intensification phases. We are not going to have max contractions as our main focus in accumulation phases. So when you think max contractions, and this gets really relative to the individual that you're working with, but max contractions can be 1 to 5, for some people 6, flirting with 7 reps, depending on how bright they can lighten that light bulb up, or, another way to say it, how deep they can really dig into their neurological system. Okay. So max contractions, those would be reserved for intensification phases. And then when we start to look at cycle types, again, you can use any type of, or cycle splits, you can use any split. So you can go full body for max contractions. Just focus on like, hey, if I'm doing full body, you might want to have 1 or 2 priorities. So you're not just like beating up the entire body and just trying to dig deep across 4 to 6 exercises. Maybe it's 1 to 2 exercises that are true intensification there. You can go upper lower as well. And then of course you can do isolated patterns and isolated muscles there. So once you determine these, you want to lay out any additional notes for the resistance split, and that will essentially wrap up focuses from a mesocycle point of view in what you're doing in resistance training. All right, now let's talk about principles of energy systems training. So we're actually going to hit aerobics and anaerobics here. Okay, so when we go back to, because we just talked about, okay, what fits really well with accumulation, intensification, so on and so forth, from a resistance standpoint, we also have to think about the same thing from an energy systems standpoint. Okay, so accumulation cycles fit well, like we talked about earlier, with those higher map works. Now what we're going to do is we're going to determine what we're doing for our aerobic training or our map work, but we've kind of already answered that question as we laid out the cycle type and we looked at what we're doing in terms of our split and what we're doing for resistance training. So by the time we get here, if we're doing accumulation, super high volume, full body resistance, we're probably not focused on map 1 when we're doing that. Okay, so accumulation cycles fit well with higher map work. So think map 9, map 8, map 7, right? Remember, it gets a little dangerous spending too much time in map 7, but map 9 to 7. Intensification cycles fit with those lower maps. Okay, so 6 all the way down to map 1. Okay, so you can move up and down the map continuum across the year, always respecting the current season and the client's recovery capacity. So we can lay out principles all day long, but you just have to, pay attention and understand what your client is and what your client is not recovering from. That's super important. So include any progression notes for the aerobic work that you're going to do here, and what this includes is like, okay, what kind of progressions am I doing in map 8? Okay, am I going to do cyclical only work? Is this a row improvement specific cycle? Do I want to do some mixed work and bring some patterns into my aerobics? Whatever that is, just go ahead and plug those notes right in here. All right, I'll save the toughest for last. So if we are prescribing pain or anaerobic work, there's just a couple things that I stress that you keep in mind when you're doing this, okay? So number one, you have to understand that this is your highest stress environment and should be treated with restraint. So just be careful on the dosage here, okay? So we don't want to overdose too much of this work throughout the training program. It does not go well with high volume accumulation cycles, okay? Because when we do high volume accumulation cycles, our brain, but more so our muscles are just fighting for recovery on a day-by-day basis. So if we just flood the system with anaerobic work on top of that, it's just not going to bode well when we're setting our clients up for poor recovery. So they should be used in shorter cycles. So remember I said I prefer 4 weeks. When I give anaerobics, it's like 3 to 4 weeks max. Okay, so I wouldn't go 8, 10, 12 weeks in anaerobic training. Okay, a situation in which you might go 8 weeks is if you're on a very specific progression in pre-competition phase, but especially if you're coaching someone for longevity, vitality, you don't even have to think about length of time because you just don't need this work for those individuals. Okay, so we have to understand that it doesn't go well with high volume, should be used in short cycles, and the effort should be really focused, and we need to make sure that we have long recovery between these, and we'll talk about that when we get to the daily plan. Okay, so we want to make sure that aerobic recovery is also built in around this work. Okay, so when we start to think about ordering of days, let's just keep that in mind. Okay, we don't want to just lift weights and do a bunch of anaerobic work. We want to get some blood flow in and make sure that we have some aerobics in there as well. So we want to plan with that in mind. We want to plan for clear transitions, and we want to plan for regeneration phases after we do this type of work. Okay, now that we understand exactly what we're doing in resistance training, in aerobic training, in anaerobic training, now what we're going to do is we're going to lay out our daily plan. We are going to actually put in what we're doing on a day-by-day basis. What will we do Monday through Sunday? When it comes to program design, this makes weekly design seamless, as these will also populate as priority tags in CoachRx on your calendar. Also keep in mind, if you go to this section for your client and you see Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and there's no other days there, make sure to head over to your training calendar or your client's training plan and just make sure that you click on the days that they plan on training, AM or PM. That's just for your context, but at least one of those has to be clicked on for that day to show up in the daily plan. So here, you just want to make sure that you're really thinking about ordering, okay? Where are things actually going when we're laying these things in? Okay, so we already have our priorities. Okay, so best practice, guys, and we're going to talk later about what goes well with what in terms of concurrent training principles, but best practice is just be really focused on any given day. So if your client's training 5 days per week, do resistance training Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Lay in the patterns that you're going to focus on. Okay, we already know contraction types. We already know goals and priorities. Now just lay in those patterns. Okay, so lay it in for Monday, lay it in for Wednesday, lay it in for Friday. And then maybe it's, Thursday or Tuesday and Saturday, they're doing their aerobic training. Go ahead and lay those in, or they're doing their aerobics and their anaerobics on those days. So I say all that to say that although there are some really good practices in terms of concurrent training and what goes well with what from an energy system standpoint, let's just stay really hyper-focused whenever you're able to do it. And let's just focus on doing resistance with resistance, aerobics with aerobics, and anaerobics with anaerobics. Okay, so if you are in a situation where you want to do resistance and aerobics with someone and you're like, I can only train, 3 times per week. Okay, different story. Okay, do your resistance training first and with your aerobics. Framework number 3 is the principle of continuity. Okay, we have to understand that mesocycles don't end, they just blend together. It's what we talked about earlier when we talked about transitioning from one cycle to another, right? It's not as simple as like my CoachRx account says this ended, so physiologically they're just ready to start the next mesocycle on Monday. Okay, we just have to make sure that we're blending those cycles in nicely. Okay, so every new cycle should essentially begin where the last one left off. So a really nice, long-term plan would be like, let's say we had 3 accumulation phases back to back to back, and you're like, hey, my progressive focus is to go from high volume to low volume, lower intensity to higher intensity. This is going to be a really simple example, but just think about like, accumulation 1, we're focused on 12 reps. Accumulation 2, we're focused on 10 reps. Accumulation 3, we're focused on 8 reps, right? So it's like the progression within the progression that's blending each mesocycle together. You don't have to completely reinvent the wheel, or you shouldn't completely reinvent the wheel every 4 weeks, right? Really think about how you can synergize and blend those cycles together. Okay. And that's how we avoid chaos and keep adaptation consistent and just flowing and natural over multiple cycles. So you can ensure this continuity inside of CoachRx by just reviewing the previous cycles notes before you design the next. Okay. So as you go from accumulation 1 to accumulation 2, keep those notes in mind in accumulation 1 and really think through, what does really good progression look like going into accumulation 2? We just talked about it in resistance training. How does that look in aerobic training? You go from long to short, right? So every mesocycle, you're just hitting a new map, okay? Or you're kind of transitioning to a faster version of the same map that you're going through, okay? So duplicating your last cycle, like really looking at it and in your brain just saying, okay, I'm going to plug that in, and then adjusting that cycle is a really good thing to do just to make sure that you always have context. Now it's time to put this into practice yourself. So to do that, just simply go back, follow the exact steps that we just walked through in this episode. And if you're not already using CoachRx, start your free 14-day trial and see how much simpler, more effective, and just congruent your program design can be. And we really just built this platform so that you can build your own coaching system inside of it. We built this platform to help you design smarter, to link your cycles seamlessly, and to actually coach your clients better. So everything that we talk about in this series, we're actually connecting it to CoachRx, and kind of you're getting some insights into our brain inside of why we built the system the way that we built it. But rest assured, we're going to always refine this thing over time. So, if you're watching this video 12 months after we filmed it, things might look a little bit different. Things will look a little bit different from when we walked you through this initially. So that'll be it for the meso. Just really keep in mind that the mesocycle, or the short-term plan, is literally your bridge between that long-term vision and your daily execution and what you're doing in your daily design. And the next part, what we're going to do is we're going to zoom all the way into the micro. So we're going to actually get into program design specifically. So we're going to take, conceptually the long-term plan. What are we really looking to do? What are we looking to accomplish over these 12 months? We'll zoom in a little bit deeper. We'll look at the mesocycle. So today we already built out priorities. What are we doing in resistance? What are we doing in aerobics? What are we doing Monday through Sunday? And then we're going to finally start actually building the, A1s to C2s. Okay, we're actually going to start putting in exercise selection based on our priorities, based on our goals, and based on our long-term plan. So until next time, appreciate it, and we will see you guys soon.